Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We are going to get started. It looks like there's about 36 of you on, and I think we have about 87 registered, so we'll wait just another second and let a few more folks get on. I am Shawn Morford. I'm the Executive Director of the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils, and I tend to be the moderator for these monthly webinars that we started doing a couple of years ago. And I see that there are a lot of new folks on the webinar that haven't joined us for these monthly webinars before. So in just a second, as we get more folks on, I'll go through a few little logistics, and then I'll introduce our presenters, and I'll hand it over to them. I want to just first recognize our sponsors. We do have two organizations that contribute financially to enable these webinars to happen. One is Pacific Corrugated Pipe Company out of Eugene. The other is OWEB, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. We very much appreciate corporate sponsorship and state sponsorship to enable these webinars to happen. As I mentioned, this is our probably most popular so far, I'd say, webinar in the 2 years that we've been doing these. Aquatic noxious weeds, Beth called it an emerging issue that's getting a lot of visibility now. So we were really thrilled that Beth and Tom were willing to sit with us and share with us what's happening in Oregon. And I'm going to hand it over to them in just a second, but I want to say just a couple of housekeeping things for us. Everybody is muted by default, and so there's a couple of ways that you can intersect with the presenters during the presentation. One is to type a question in the question box that you have, and I'll be monitoring those, and I'll look for the right moment to interrupt Beth and Tom to put your question forward, and everybody will hear the answer. We won't necessarily say who asked it, but we'll make sure that everybody hears the answer. The other way that you can be involved here is to raise your little icon hand, and that will alert me that you want to be unmuted, and I'll unmute you and let you ask your question or make your comment. So we welcome you to participate in either way. We have the full hour. Beth and Tom didn't think that their presentation would take the full hour, so we do have time for comments and questions. As I mentioned, we do these every month, and at the end of the webinar, you'll have a survey, and we really hope that you we're really counting on you to take just a couple of seconds at the end to give us your comments and feedback, and also to give us ideas for future webinars. The target of these webinars are SWCDs and watershed councils and land trusts in Oregon, because we're the Oregon Conservation Partnership and we support them. But we welcome this forum to be used in any way that's useful to the conservation community. So let us know what topics we can put forward, and by all means, let us know how useful. In what ways this was useful today. We need to tell our funders and our sponsors the difference that these webinars make to the folks that are on. So please take a second to do that. The last I'll say is, before I introduce Beth and Tom, is that these sessions are always recorded, and we post them on the Network of Oregon Watershed Council's website. So if you want to share with folks that couldn't make it today, by all means, you can send them the link to that, or send them to our website. And I'll probably get that up by Monday or so. Okay, so Beth and Tom both work for the Oregon Department of Agriculture. Beth Myers-Shanai is the invasive plant specialist with the Noxious Weed Control Program. She's been there for about 10 years. Her focus is mapping, outreach, and managing the high priority noxious weed control projects. And Tom is in a different conference room in the same building, and he is the projects coordinator with ODA in the Noxious Weed Control Program, and he works with largely with the federal partners and other land managers in the control activities. So Beth is going to start us off. She's going to run the PowerPoint for Tom, and we'll get started. So we'll try and keep this as as live as we can, even though we're all in a different place. We've done these enough that it's just us. So by all means, ask questions and make comments as we go. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Beth.
All right, thanks a lot, Sean. Before I switch over, I just wanted to mention that that we're really thankful to have this opportunity. It's great that we can reach so many people and kind of sit here in our own office and still get this word out to everybody. I'm going to go ahead and turn my video off because in our little practice sessions, it just seemed to work better without my video on, and then I'll launch into our program. Okay, so let's get us started here. This is the Aquatic Weeds and Water Quality Ecosystem Game Changers presentation. And it's just our attempt to bring in together some of the information that's been gathered, some current and ongoing research right here in the Willamette Valley, and kind of the bigger picture of aquatic noxious weeds. It's been definitely an emerging issue, especially over the last decade, where we've seen some huge growth in aquatic noxious weeds. But first, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about the Noxious Weed Control Program. It is our mission to protect Oregon's natural resources and agricultural economy from the invasion and proliferation of invasive noxious weeds. And noxious weed specifically is just a regulated weed, so it's kind of a subset of weeds that are known to be invasive that are specifically regulated by a governing body like the state of Oregon. And our program's main focuses are survey and detection, so we're supporting survey efforts and directly surveying for noxious weeds in many different ways. We've got some estuary surveys going on for cordgrass. We keep our eye out for giant hogweed and ornamental invasive. We've been working on detecting hawkweeds and some yellow tuft. Get up sometimes in helicopters to look around for yellow tuft in Southwest Oregon. If something is found, then we go into our rapid response and treatment mode. And these are some examples of ones that have been found in the last few years. Kudzu is probably one of our biggest success stories, and it was found in a couple of places and stopped pretty quickly. That one's considered eradicated in Oregon now. One of our most recent finds is that garden yellow loosestrife that was found on an island in the Willamette in Yamhill County. We have a very robust biological control program. Oregon's one of the leaders in the nation in developing a program. A couple of successes shown up on the screen there. Control of tansy ragwort with this tiny flea beetle probably doesn't get as much credit as its showier cinnabar moth cohort, but it's really the one that's been doing most of the work. And we've had great success on controlling purple loosestrife with Galaricella beetles. Outreach and education is a strong component of our program too, as you're witnessing right now. This is one of our outreach efforts. We've put on some symposiums and forums, and we have a presence at the state fair, and we've helped support the invasive species education station, which rolls around different parts of Oregon and provides kind of a little nucleus of education at different fairs and outreach events. But our staff really get around to a lot of different groups and organizations to give presentations and have a social media presence, just try to get the word out. And we work in close conjunction with the Oregon State Weed Board. The State Weed Board is the body that makes final decisions on any weeds that will be put on the state noxious weed list. And they also give the final determination on what grants will be funded through our Oregon State Weed Board grant program. Our staff serves as the review committee, and unfortunately those stats that you see there are a little outdated. We've given away, we just had another round of grants that were successfully funded, so those numbers would be a little bit higher now by probably at least 50 or 6, well, probably about 50 more grants and more dollars. And I'm going to pass it on to Tom now. I'll be running the main presentation, and so Tom will need to give me some cues about anything you might need pointed out or when to move on to the next slide. So just be ready for that.
Okay, thank you, Beth. I'm going to talk first a little bit about some of the impacts of weeds and more generally about noxious weeds. And I also want to emphasize and connect the point that, even upland weeds and riparian weeds are providing, doing a lot of impacts to our water systems and aquatic systems. So I'll first kind of touch on a few examples. But start with, just in Oregon alone, there's about 83 million in annual impact from a small subset of the weeds that we looked at with an economic assessment. And nationally, weeds are having significant impacts to our systems out there too, of about 27 billion. And so we have a lot of economic impacts that are really easy to identify and put numbers on, but there's also a lot of impacts that are happening to our natural ecosystems, and one of those things is loss of biodiversity. It also impacts a lot of our natural resources and the management of our natural resources, as well as recreation, agriculture and forest production. So next, Beth. Just to make some of these points about some of the weeds that we are working with, they do have impacts both in riparian areas and upland areas, and those are terrestrial type weeds. And even in these terrestrial systems, they are impacting water quality through hydrologic cycles and hydrologic functions, by impacting temperatures and nutrient cycling and water chemistry, and how they influence runoff and sedimentation rates and so forth. And then just their impacts of these non-natives moving into native plant communities and the impacts they have on community structure and ecosystems. Okay. So one example I wanted to illustrate here is spotted knapweed. In a natural system like this, it would be dominated by bunch grasses. And when spotted knapweed becomes dominant, it often forms monoculture in these uplands. And there's a lot of things that are taking place behind the scenes, both with moisture cycling and with nutrient cycling. You have a much deeper rooted plant with spotted knapweed illustrated on the left versus a more fibrous rooted plant on the right, a bunch grass that would normally occupy these sites. And that has an impact on soil erosion and the ability to keep soil on these upland sites and prevent erosion down into our waterways and so forth. So that's just one brief example. Next, Beth. And there are more significant impacts in our riparian zones, or more obvious impacts. A lot of the weeds that are upland problems are also problems in these riparian zones. And I think some that people are really quite familiar with are things like blackberry that often dominates our watersheds and forms very dense stands that compete with recruitment of trees. They can push out a lot of our native forbs and shrubs. Other examples are gorse and brooms. And we also have a lot of invasives that form monocultures and push out our native forbs and grasses. And all these things have impacts from reducing tree recruitment back into these areas, as well as impacting shade and canopy structure, woody debris deposits back into the system, and soil stability. I think a good example of that is Japanese knotweed. It's a plant that is deciduous during the winter, and so it has a lot of open ground, and often does very well in these riparian zones and can dominate large areas and significantly contribute to erosion. And when you have multiple species layered on top of each other, you have ground covers that are pushing out our natives and increasing erosion, as well as things like English ivy that are starting to increase or accelerate the loss of woody material from these sites. And then the compounding effect of blackberry and brooms and others that prevent recruitment of trees. It really does have a profound impact. Okay, Beth. And of course, our aquatics, they have direct impacts to our water systems, either preventing flow, directly impacting water quality, reducing the ability to deliver water through irrigation systems. They can alter the chemical composition, and they can also have impacts on vector control and other things. And I think one thing that we often overlook is how much open water is lost by a lot of these floating type plants or emergent type plants. And not only does it affect the surface, but it also affects the water column. And we'll touch a little bit on that here later. Next. And so the more these species that get introduced, it prompts us to manage them and have to put more resources from homeowners to ag production and forestry and right-of-way. And all those things contribute to our inputs, both of herbicides as well as manual control and other treatments. And all those things cost money, as well as contribute to more impacts to our water resources. Okay. I think another point that we often overlook is how these invasives impede conservation and restoration efforts. We've invested heavily into salmon restoration and conservation. Currently in the Willamette system alone, just the state dollars are over 20 million invested, and on the Columbia system, over 2 billion. And so there's large efforts and resources going into these projects. And just a few of the invasive weeds that, and 3 that we're going to talk about today, could really undo a lot of the work that's been done. So I want to emphasize that too. Okay, Beth. Just back to aquatic and the impacts that they have. One of the things that I'll have you go ahead and advance the next slide, Beth, is that they change these systems dramatically. A lot of the open water that we have here can be changed significantly by especially the 3 species that we're going to be talking about today, invasives. And that changes the habitat and makes it more inducive to a lot of our introduced warm water game fish. And that can have a direct impact on salmonids and other native fish that we're trying to conserve. Okay, Beth.
Okay, I'm going to slip in here again, and we'll kind of give it just a quick background as we dive into the specifics of aquatic noxious weeds and what's happening with those on the ground. We'll just back up a little bit and kind of just do a little quick overview of aquatics in general, aquatic plants in general. So the different types of plants are illustrated by this slide. A lot of what we're talking about today, some of the key players are going to be emergent vegetation or rooted floating vegetation for noxious weeds. But of course, we've also had some submerged types like Brazilian waterweed or aquatic milfoils, water milfoils that are submerged vegetation. They don't take exactly the form you see in this slide, but they're rooted plants that fill the entire water column up to the surface with material as well. It's some of these emergent plants, though, especially that have become some of the biggest problems now. But we don't want to vilify all aquatic plants. There's definitely, they are an important part of aquatic systems and our ecosystems overall. They're providing habitat, they are recycling oxygen and CO2, helping balance pH, improving water clarity in in certain systems, and so we want to identify that not all aquatic plants are bad. They are an important part of the system, and we're trying to help maintain the correct balance of open water systems and where the right plants are supposed to be. I don't see a picture of Wapato here, but that's definitely a very important aquatic emergent plant in the Willamette system that we're trying to preserve habitat for. So how do the noxious aquatic plants get here? So a lot of it intentional introductions, especially with the ones that we'll be talking about in detail today. All three of the main ones we'll be talking about have been introduced as ornamentals, but they also can come in forage products or in aquarium dumping, which is another form of ornamental. Might be inside your house and then not realize that once it gets out of control, you don't want it, so you dump it outside not knowing what's going to happen. But boats and other activities of humans and other animals can move these around as well. And we do have a boat inspection station at certain borders during key seasons in Oregon that are looking for not just those quagga mussels and zebra mussels, but fragments of aquatic invasive plants as well. These are a couple of local area infestations that were specifically reported as aquarium dumps. One of them down in Eugene and another one up in Washington. So one little aquarium dumped in the wrong spot can lead to infestations like you see here. So what's the primary spread of these aquatic species? So the initial introductions are often vertebrate dispersal, even human or other kinds, birds, other mammals may be able to move it from one water body to a complete new water body. Then once the species is introduced, then hydrochory or flowing with the water is generally how they're dispersed. And you can see one picture there where there's some rooting at the stem node on that plant across the hand there. So some of those plants can float around and start growing those roots while they're free flowing in the column of water, and eventually they get to a shallow enough spot where they can root. And then sometimes just the buoyant seeds themselves, there's like a little canoe of new seedlings, they're ready to land someplace and get started. So with that flow, once the initial introduction, you can have pretty rapid spread through the system. And it's important to note, you may have seen this table or graph quite a few times in relation to invasives and the importance of finding them early. But with aquatics, we have to think that this timeline can be quite compressed from introduction to widespread, just because these aquatic plants can move so quickly through flowing water and often have very rapid reproduction systems. And I'm going to pass it back to Tom again as we dive into the specific weeds here.
Okay, yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about three invasives that we are working a lot with: yellow flowing heart, flowering rush, and water primrose. And two of these are really still quite limited throughout Oregon, and one is becoming much more common, and that's the glugia. And all these have potential to have major impacts, and most of the systems they're invading, and those including habitat and ecosystem impacts and potential impacts to species that we're trying to conserve, as well as impacts directly to restoration efforts that are taking place. And they can affect water availability and flow and irrigation, and even have some potential to impact drinking water systems. And they all can impede access and for recreation and fishing and other things too. So that's another impact that we really haven't touched on much. Go ahead, Beth. So yellow floating heart, Nymphoides, is one that has been in Oregon since 2004, was the first infestation that we found in Washington County. And that was actually reported to Portland State University. And we have worked with Portland State University to control that site in Washington County. But one thing that's been happening over the last 10 years is we're finding more and more sites. A lot of sites were showing up down in Lane County and east, or and south, and east over in Deschutes County. And we've had really mixed results with our control from site to site. I'll have you go to the next slide, please, Beth. One site, Willow Sump in Douglas County, we've actually had quite good control. This has been working with the Forest Service on the Umpqua National Forest. And Glenn Miller and Carrie Porosco, our Southwest Oregon regional person, have worked a lot on this infestation over the last 2 years and have seen pretty good success. But like I had mentioned, we haven't seen that consistently from site to site. One thing about most of the yellow floating heart infestations that we have found so far is they've been contained to ponds, either ornamental ponds where it's been introduced, or smaller ponds, ag ponds, irrigation ponds, and a few wild areas such as Willow Sump and a couple other lakes down in Southwest Oregon. Have you advanced next slide, please? And the next slide. One thing that we did find the year before last is that there is a sizable infestation on the Willamette River, and that's at Dodson Slough in Linn County. And that's a real concern because we're now not in a contained system. And this plant is, hit or miss on how easy it is to control. And there are a lot of complications with this particular site for implementing control. Not only is it in an open system, it also is an area that's used for irrigation, and the potential for spread by high water and flood events is greatly increased.
I'd like to. Oh,
yeah.
Sorry, can I interject here just a second, Tom?
Sure.
I meant to put in an image here, and I forgot to do it, of the satellite view of this area. It's actually in Lane County because it's right at the southern edge of Eugene.
Okay. Sorry.
And but we have on one side a gravel operation, and on the other side of the slough a golf course, and on the upper ends of the slough 3 or 4 different residential private properties. And so that really also complicates the management of an area like this.
Okay. Next slide, please. So another aquatic that we've been recently found in Oregon is flowering rush. That was actually found in 2014. Also another survey done by Portland State University. I'll have you advance the next slide, please. And currently, most of those infestations are in the mid-Columbia, in the Wallua, behind the McNary Dam, and there are a few infestations as far west as Boardman. Go ahead, advance, please. And on to the next slide. And this last summer, we actually found another site down in Klamath County, and that, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit out of whack here with my slides.
Oh, yep. Sorry. Can you see where the...
There we go. So one of the early introductions of flowering rush to the west is in Montana and Flathead Lake, and I think this picture demonstrates quite well some of the impacts that potential impacts of flowering rush. And it was first found in the 60s in Montana, and has since moved into the Columbia system. And next slide, please. And is also in the Aberdeen irrigation system in Idaho. And so it's really has been knocking at our door for quite some time. It is also in the Yakima River on the Columbia system, and is now, here in Oregon. I'll have you go on to the next slide, please. One of the new sites.
Tom?
Yes.
Yeah. When you get to a stopping place, I've got a question about knapweed. So when you finish with this one, I'll ask the question.
Okay, that sounds good. This last summer, one new site was found in Klamath County near Bonanza, and that was actually a site that was reported to us by one of our federal partners. And this happens to be a ornamental planting. Have you advanced the next slide, please, Beth? And this is an area that's used for wedding events and is how it was found by I'm sorry, a little bit. I just got a little off whack here, sorry. By our partner, and I'll have to regain my thoughts. I apologize. Do you want to take over for a minute, Beth?
I think, wasn't this found by one of our federal partners who was there maybe at the venue?
Yes, at a wedding venue down in Klamath County, and we have since been able to get the site treated this last summer. It is a koi pond. I'm really apologize. I just got a little bit flustered and lost my train of thought here.
Do you want to take the question?
Yeah, that would be great.
Buy yourself a second here. Okay, so this is, I think it's regards to an earlier slide in regards to knapweed, asking about your theory that having a deep root system encourages soil erosion at upland sites as opposed to shallow root system of tufted grass.
Correct.
That makes, yeah.
Yeah, the main point behind that is that we, with the bench grass, you have a shallow rooted plant that can hold the soil in place because of the fibrous root system. Whereas with spotted knapweed, you have a thin, deep rooted taproot. And there have been some studies to show that with runoff and even wind erosion, that the fibrous plants just hold the soil in place better. Does that answer your question?
I'll ask whoever's asking it can let us know whether there's a follow-up question to that. Yeah, thanks, Tom.
Okay, I'll try to get back on track here. Sorry for losing my place. It's a little difficult between not having the prompt of the slides in front of me. Go ahead, Beth, please.
Okay.
So that kind of brings us to one of our next plant that I want to talk a little bit about, and that's water primrose, Ligwigia. And the other two species that we're talking about really are early detection rapid response species. The yellow floating heart and the flowering rush are relatively early in their introduction into the state and their expansion. But with the water primrose, it is becoming quite well established on the Willamette system, and it's actually starting to spread exponentially at that faster rate of spread. You can kind of think back to that growth curve that Beth showed us earlier. So the next slide, please. And there's a lot of things going on here with Ligwigia. You know, a lot of our backwaters are open waters, and with Ligwigia, it establishes on the banks and then moves out into the open water and forms these very heavy, dense mats. And a lot of these mats get so thick and heavy that you can actually get out and walk on them. And so they have a lot of impacts on our natives. They have impacts on a lot of the restoration projects that we've implemented for salmonids and the Oregon chub. And they have potential to impact reptiles. It also reduces a lot of the open water that would normally be on these sites and at these sites. And one thing that's really different is a lot of the Ligwigia has been contained to these backwaters into sloughs or even sloughs that are cut off from the main stem of the river. But now we're seeing heavy patches starting to be on the main stem, out on the main banks, and actually overwintering on these outer banks of the Willamette system. So it really is starting to spread at a much more rapid rate, and it's just becoming more prevalent, especially in the mid Willamette system. Okay, Beth.
There's a question, is anybody researching biological control for it?
Yes, they are, and we will kind of touch on that a little bit later in the presentation.
Okay. Tom, you also have a question about flowering rush before we get too far.
Sure.
Has there been research on water quality effects of flowering rush? If so, what are the effects in a nutshell?
There have not been a lot of studies that I'm aware of on flowering rush. And that's one of the problems that we struggle with a lot of invasives as a whole. There's not a lot of really good, strong, documented information, and a lot of it is somewhat anecdotal. And that's one thing I am going to highlight here in a minute about Lagwigia in particular is we do have some, at least baseline information now on Lagwigia on the Willamette system. And there's been other work done by Brenda Gruhl out of California where with ARS, and she's done a lot more to document the impacts of Lagwigia in California. But we don't have a lot of clear information on flowering rush, no.
Okay, back to Lagwigia. Are there state resources, grants, technical assistance, etc., to help manage it?
There are. We put out Oregon State Weed Board grants, and that's a relatively small pot of money, but that is available. And we really do look at where we can target and make a difference with those dollars. So for the big, broad scale, wide, system-wide approach, those are not going to be dollars that are going to be adequate enough to deal with this problem. OWEB has also funded some projects, and the Meyer Foundation has done a lot to fund projects. But from what I understand, I'm not sure how much longer they'll be funding some of the projects that have gone on out there. So to answer your question, that is what is needed, is some additional resources to go toward invasives as a whole, and in particular, a lot of these aquatics that are now becoming major problems in the Willamette and the Columbia system. Okay, I'll have you advance, Beth. So this is the type of impacts we're seeing. This is an aerial view in the previous picture, and this is on the ground at Scatterbar on the Willamette. And you just have a closing of the canopy and a closing of the system, and that's also affecting everything under the canopy. So the water column is being impacted also. Okay. So I did want to touch on a little bit of research that has been done to document some of these impacts. And Rich Miller and Kurt Carpenter are the two lead people for that. And Rich presented to us last spring at a forum that we had on aquatics and provided some really good information. So I pulled a couple of the key nuggets out of that, and I want to share those. And that was an assessment of water, both water quality and also biomass that was done on the Willamette system. Okay, next. So the goals of the assessment was to assess the aquatic plant community status of Lagwigia and infested channels and habitats, and assess the water quality conditions under baseline conditions. And that work was done at Windsor Slough and Mission Lake. And what they did is collect biomass information. So they looked at how much of that biomass was native and non-native, and also they looked at the water quality at those sites, and that was water temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, turbidity, and so forth. Okay, Beth. So some of the conclusions from that study is that Lagwigia is the biggest contributor to biomass, both of native and introduced species, and that it's a very high biomass production, which is kind of obvious from the pictures that we have shown. And a lot of that really is most significant in shallower waters at 3.5 feet and less. And so the impacts from that are, the major impacts are loss of open water and also organic enrichment, both of the sediment and the water column. So you're having an enrichment of dead and dying material that's accumulating on the bottom in the sediment, as well as an enrichment of the water column, and that's primarily from algae and chlorophyll and the slowing of the water, increasing turbidity. And a result of that is community respiration in the water, and the bed sediments cause low oxygen conditions. And so you can have these real big swings in dissolved oxygen and pH in these areas that are heavily infested with Liguiglia. And I think one of the major concerns with that is the impacts of low oxygen and limited oxygen on our cold water fish. Okay, next. Another piece of the puzzle that Rich looked at was also compared Collins Bay, and this is an area where treatments have taken place for at least 4 years now, to an untreated site, the Scatter Bar, which I highlighted in a few pictures so far. I think the real takeaway from that information is that you can control Liguiglia. The densities of Liguiglia are dramatically reduced in the treatment sites, and there is a higher diversity of natives that come back on these treatment sites. But another point is that Liguiglia is still present. You still have a lot of seedlings coming back. It still is there even after multiple years of treatment. I'll have you go to the next slide, please. So, at Collins Bay and the Delta Ponds and Golden Gardens, these are a couple of areas where we've had relatively large areas being treated. We have demonstrated that you can control Liguiglia, but I think the longer term question is, how long can we manage those sites, and how long do you have to manage those sites to keep them under control or gain the level of control that we're after? And I'll have you go to the next slide. Yes.
There's a question about where to get a copy of the study.
Yes, I think getting that directly from Rich would probably be the best option. I'm not sure if it's actually published, and he's with Portland State University, and I think we can get that information to you so you can post that later after our talk.
Okay, I'll post it with the recording on our website.
Okay. So that does bring forward some questions. These two studies, as well as a lot of the work that's been done, over the last decade in Oregon on Liguiglia in particular. And I think some of the questions that come to my mind are, what are the other long-term impacts that we're going to see from this? We're already starting to see some. We have a lot of anecdotal and observational information. We don't have a lot of documented information, but I think there's going to be more long-term impacts as the systems really start to change. And I think it asks, the question, can we effectively control the populations and prevent the spread on a system-wide scale? And I think another thing that, if you're not asking this question, is how should this fit into our planning for restoration on the Willamette? And are you considering that? And I think a lot of these stream channel restoration projects that are going on, where we're reopening, in some cases, areas that have Liguiglia in them back to the main stem and so forth, and a lot of the restoration projects that are taking place out there, are we considering these aquatics in the process?
There's a comment, Tom. Siuslaw Watershed Council is concerned about Triangle Lake, where there's widespread liquidia.
Yes.
And it feeds into Lake Creek, which feeds into the Siuslaw, which is, of course, important to salmonids. One concern is fragmentation. A lot of water skiing, boating, and swimming. What kind of treatments are suggested? Whoops, I lost it. What kind of treatments are suggested, I believe, is the question.
Yeah, that is an infestation that we are aware of. It happens to be in an area that is, aquatics are already a touchy issue to address with any type of management, mechanical control as well as herbicides. We don't have a good partner there to work with on that particular project, but we are aware of it. It may be something that we could work with the Watershed Council. It may be something that we could work with a local SWCD. But to answer your question, it is one of these areas that's a little bit tricky because of some of the anti-herbicide people that are in the area. So I don't know if we could effectively implement herbicide treatments there or not. Mechanical control may be an option. Glenn Miller is the person who is most familiar with that, and maybe Beth could have some input on that. But
yeah, I would say there's such high, residential property around that lake that the first good step for that area is going to need to be an outreach and education about the issue of that plant specifically. Kind of like what we saw, we did a big treatment on the Metolius River of ribbon grass, and it wasn't until we got the Friends of the Metolius River got behind the project that a lot of progress was made on treating in that system. I think Triangle Lake would be kind of a similar situation. A lot of meetings and education and finding the right group to partner with that can help with that on the ground landowner education would be important for that system before we could start on any kind of control.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Tom, can I ask a few more questions that have come in, or am I interrupting your flow now?
Well, I just make one more statement, and then I'll be done with that. And then I think the other big question is, how is global climate change and warming going to impact the reproduction rate and mechanisms of Liguigia? And so I can kind of close that off and answer some questions.
Okay, great. So Benton, SWC, I think it's Benton, has a copy of the report, of the Miller report, and it looks like they're going to send it to me, and I will post it with the recording. So
excellent.
Okay, so here some questions are popping in now. So this plant, and I am not sure what plant now we're talking about. Maybe Kai, you can tell me again. This plant's been discovered in the Rogue, a wild and scenic river. Are you aware of this location?
We are aware of Liguigia in the Rogue system, and it's something that we are concerned about.
And how does jet boat activity in particular potentially contribute to or vector yellow water primrose?
I think it can be a very major vector of any three of these species, but especially the two, the Liguigia, the mat forming one, and the yellow floating heart. But any of them, if you're in sites that are heavily infested and fragments are getting attached to boats and you're moving that around, not only is it going to move it within the system, but it's also potential to move it to wherever you take the boat next. So those are all real concerns, and not only for movement on site, but for introductions to new sites.
Okay, a few more questions coming in. What were the control methods used at Willow Sump? And if you could just say where Willow Sump again is, to get that 95% reduction of the yellow floating heart.
Yeah, Willow Sump is on the Umpqua National Forest, and that was an herbicide application. 2 years worth of herbicide application.
Okay. Thank you. And one more I'll share here. Given the most invasive treatment plans focus on suppressing the non-native and then establishing natives, my understanding is that there is no native to compete with Ludwigia. So how do you deal with it reinvading?
Yeah, I think those are some of the things that we really are struggling with. And I'll kind of answer this in a couple different ways. We often look at a lot of these new invaders as we want to, we don't want to just suppress them, we want to try to eradicate them. The Ludwigia is a little bit different situation because of how widespread it's becoming. You know, it's beyond eradication in the state, and so it really is management. But in outlying sites and new areas where it's just starting to pop up, really the goal is to suppress it or try to locally eradicate it. But I don't think we have any real good answers for the heavily infested parts of the systems, because, for example, as the question states, how do you outcompete that? I think we're going to have to learn to live with Ludwigia in a lot of these sites.
Can I interject here for a second too, Tom?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I think for that water primrose Ludwigia issue, we're really just trying to hold our fingers in the dike until hopefully some biological control can come in. It would really be the only effective system-wide suppressant in the long run. Up to that point, you're going to need to just really do intensive long-term management of sites that you have restored, because it will always be re-emerging if you just turn your back and walk away at any point, really.
And one more question: how would you suggest beginning control of Ludwigia in the Rogue River system?
I think it's something that, for one thing, I would contact our regional staff down there, and we are aware of it. And it's something that we need to get a regional plan going for. So I think that's there's a lot of opportunity to work with our federal partners as well as local partners in the area. And I'm not sure exactly all the details about the location, if it's, you know, what the ownership is, and that would be some of the first questions. Just like Beth had mentioned earlier about the Triangle Lake, we'll need to inform everyone who would be involved, from landowners to you know, the federal partners that would be involved, and really need to seek out how widespread it is with surveys and so forth, and start implementing control.
Right. Okay, I think we should probably move on so we can get to some of the what can we do about it issues too, before we run out of time completely.
Yep, go for it.
All right, I'm going to see what we have coming up next. I think we may have, there's that last little, you want to make a comment about this one, Tom?
Oh, yes. One of the things that did come in this last summer and was an email to one of our staff, Glenn Miller, and it was from the Warm Water Game Fish program with ODF&W, and they actually put out monitoring nets for their warm water game fish to get fish counts and that type of thing. One of the things that they observed this summer at Oxbow Slough here just outside of Salem at Minnow Brown Park is some die-off, and they suspect that it actually is linked to the Ludwigia infestations. This is actually a picture of the site. It's very heavily infested with Ludwigia, and the other thing that probably was a contributing factor was just the warmer temperatures this summer and the warmer water temperatures, and probably resulted in lower oxygen levels and some die-off in their monitoring nets. And what was a bit unusual is they normally don't see any mortality in their monitoring nets. So,
and I think this was 100% mortality except for a couple of catfish or something. It wasn't just a few, it was almost all of them.
Yeah, so a significant, and I think the other point to take home from that, these aren't the cold water fish. These are actually the warmer water fish, and they often can do better in lower oxygen situations. So that is a little bit more than just observation, but a little bit more documented impacts. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to kind of speed through the rest here, but make sure that you are walk away with some places to go for further information on different things that you can do in managing aquatic weeds or learning more about them. I've got a few key identification tips for each of these species if you want to be on the lookout for them, especially our 2 A-listed species, which the first of which here is yellow floating heart. So this is one that roots in the substrate in water 12 to 13 feet. It's got heart-shaped leaves, but they're very small. About 4 to 5 inches would be a big one. A lot of them are just 1 or 2 inches. And then they have these little erect stemmed flowers that will sit up above the surface where the leaf is floating. And this picture kind of in the center you can actually see a lot of seed pods, and that's from that site on Dodson Slough off the Willamette, which has been there for a while but was just recently discovered, but really some high seed production going on there. But it also reproduces extensively by stolons. For identification for flowering rush, it is not a rush, which is why it has that hyphen in the name. It has square stems. The emergent vegetation is a lot kind of stiffer, hardier material than the submerged, and this one can grow in pretty deep water, so it can grow, it can start rooted in the substrate and then grow down lower and lower into up to 20 feet of water, and then continue its growth upward from that level. As you can see, it continues to grow. See if I can get my pointer. These little bulblets continue to just branch off each other and keep growing outward from the initial infestation. It has 3 true petals and then 3 sepals that are all pink, so it kind of looks like a 6-petaled flower. And keys for Ludwigia, or water primrose, it has 2 growth forms of its leaves. The juvenile leaves are rounder. Both of these pictures are juvenile leaves. I'm hoping you can see my pointer moving through there. And then the mature leaves are longer, spear-shaped leaves, and it can grow up off the top of the water's surface 3 feet or so. It quite bushy, quite emergent, and that's why treatment teams control have been able to just walk out on top of those mats. Another really key feature of it I have over on the right hand side of the slide is the erynchymus roots, these special roots that are able to exchange oxygen from the surface even though the plant is growing in the water, and one of the reasons why it's an invasive and so successful is that it's really great at producing those roots. The juvenile form of this can just be free floating, so if a fragment breaks off, it'll just float and live, and the roots will start growing out of nodes until it bumps into some shallower water, and then it becomes mature after it roots in the substrate. If you want more information, good identification resources, a couple of good manuals and books are listed here, and so you can follow up when this presentation gets posted to get more on those. I had to give a shout out to Benton SWCD. They've been some of the pioneers in trying out treatment of water primrose and have gotten some grants from ODA and helped put out this guide, which is good outside of Benton County for sure. Anywhere in the Willamette system, that's a good guide for some of the common aquatic invasives. And then our website has profiles that can pop open with images, and you can get a whole profile page PDF, more info on distribution and photos. And then if you find any of these, especially the A-listed species, a couple of good reporting options. The Oregon Invasives Hotline.org is probably the best because you can map where you found an infestation and upload pictures as well. And there's a local agency person assigned to each of those. And then ODA staff monitors for any of the A-listed ones that pop in, so we can make sure that we are responding quickly. A few different ways you can go see how weeds are mapped in Oregon. Weed Mapper website, IMAP Invasives, EdMaps. A lot of, we share data across these different platforms, but they're a great way to see where weeds have already been found and what their distribution are in Oregon. For management, I want to go specifically for two of the plants we've been talking about here. We had a forum just about a year ago, a one-day conference just on these two plants and their management. And there's a great resource packet available, as well as the PDFs of the presentations that were given. So you can follow, you can just Google search it quickly, or you can follow this web link to ODA Noxious Weed Program and look for the link for forums. I just also wanted to go back quickly. There is biocontrol research happening on, I think, all three of these, but it's at very early levels, and there haven't been any. I think maybe the water primrose may have some biocontrol testing happening down in the California area, but other than that, the other two are in the early stages of finding of insects or other agents. Educational resources, Play Clean Go is probably the best one to use to educate constituents who might be recreators about how they can move these species around. But we also have great brochures, and we use our social media. We did do a live stream feed on Facebook back in September when we broadcast right from Minto Brown Park there. And probably most important is ways to network. There is a network called the Willamette Aquatic Invasives Network, where all different agencies and interested parties are coming together at least a couple times a year to compare notes, share successes, and just really keep everybody in the loop on what's going on. We have a couple of listservs that we facilitate conversations by email, and there are local cooperative weed management areas all over Oregon where people come together and can talk about what's happening locally. And a plug for our next Interagency Noxious Weed Symposium, which is a premier networking event, as well as a lot of great presentations. Also, here is our regional staff. So I'm here in the Northwest region. Tom is our projects coordinator. He works out of the Salem office. And again, since this will be shared, you can go back and get more information about who your regional person is if you're not here in the Willamette Valley with us right now. And some special thanks to some research and information that was shared as part of our presentation here. And I think that wraps it up. Just 2 minutes off the mark there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. A lot of important information. It's good that you spent the last 5 or 6, 7 minutes going through the resources because that's questions that we get a lot from watershed councils is what resources are available, not just materials, but who are our partners that we should be working with. So appreciate that very much. I don't see any other questions, so I'll just make one last plea for any final questions you might have. If you want me to call on you, I can do that. And if not, I don't want to rush the end here, but looks like we've got all the questions asked that that have come in. So I want to take this time then to just thank Tom and Beth for preparing for today and making this information available. It's going to be recorded in perpetuity now, so you can share it with any of your folks, Beth and Tom, or any of you are welcome to download it and have a look again, or to send it to others. I have a question for you, quick, Beth and Tom. Is the PowerPoint going to be available, or just the recording?
We can make the PowerPoint available, yeah.
Okay, so if you send it to me, I'll post it with the recording then. So those slides with the phone numbers and contacts will be quickly available to folks if they just want to click on that link and scroll down to the bottom of the slides, and they should get it. So once again, thank you to everyone for participating, and to our sponsors, Pacific Corrugated Pipe, and to OWEB, and for ODA for making your time available. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
please, everybody take a moment to fill out the survey, give us ideas for future webinars. And if you want to get on the mailing list to receive information on upcoming webinars, put your email address in the survey box there somewhere, and I'll add you to the list. So, all right, I'm going to end this webinar now. Thank you, everybody, once again. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting us, Sean.
Thank you.